You've all been looking at gender equality. What I'm going to talk about today is gender inequality. There are some very good reasons, good in the negative sense. There are some very strong reasons why today we have to fight for gender equality. And that is because for 2,000-3,000 years, there has been gender inequality. And that gender inequality comes from different factors. It comes from our religion, it comes from our philosophy, and it comes from our science, and it comes from our legal system. So those four rivers, those four currents have influenced the way that Western Europe, and I noticed in your research you did a wonderful comparison between Eastern and Western marriages and the rights of women in the two types of marriages. Unfortunately, in our Western tradition, women have always not had rights. The rights they had were good to a certain extent, but they were never completely equal with men's rights. And the example, I cannot remember which of you wonderful people, gave the example of land owning and property. When a woman is widowed, in the Western tradition, she loses pretty well everything and has to start again. So that is just a fact of life. Now, let me turn this like this. Our Western tradition really comes from two major currents. One of them is the Hebrew Christian tradition, and the other one is the Greek and Roman tradition. And we today, as Western Europeans, are what we are because of these two very important traditions. So I'm going to look at some of the early texts in these traditions that tell us something about genders and the roles of the two sexes. In the very first book of the Bible is called the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, the ancient scriptures tell us the story of how God created the world. What's really interesting about Genesis is that it tells two completely different stories. It tells two very different stories about the beginning of the world. Genesis chapter 1 tells us one story. Genesis chapter 2 tells us something completely different. And I gave you those two texts so that you can compare them. If we look at Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the world. When we get to verses 24, 25, 26, 27, it says how God created mankind. And I'm going to use that one. It says, and God said, this is now day 6. Okay, so God has created light and dark, the waters, the air, the world. At day 6, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the cattle according to their kinds, and everything that creeps upon the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them, and notice that plural, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Now here's the very important verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. I thought I had the Latin. Look, I didn't write down the Latin. But in the Latin, it's more the same. It's created homo, mankind. Now, notice that here, God creates man and woman simultaneously, at the same time. It's simultaneous creation story. That is not the story we normally think of. When we talk about the creation of mankind, this is not what we remember. When we look at a picture of God creating man and woman, this is not what we are seeing. So this is the story that has disappeared from our culture. You follow me? Yes. The story we remember is a completely different story, and it's the one that the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 2. And I gave you Genesis chapter 2. some sections of it. It starts off in verse 4, where it retells the story. It starts all over again, saying, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plants of the field was yet on the earth and no herbs of the field had yet sprung up." Somewhere around 9 to 15, God creates man. Then at 15, he puts him on earth. And man is alone in this story. Then at verse 18, God has second thoughts. It says, "And then God said, it is not good for the man that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So notice, man is alone. God says it's not good. He's going to give him a helper. Now look at the helpers that God gives him. The very first ones. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast in the field, every bird in the air, blah, 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 and so forth. So God creates all the animals to be helpers to man. Then notice what happens at verse 20. The man gave names to all cattle and to the birds of the air and to every beast of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper fit for him. So all these helpers are no good. So the Lord God, verse 21, caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Do you see what happened? Woman is being listed here as part of that list of helpers for man. That includes the cattle, the fish, the birds. Woman is part of that animal group that is created by God to help man. Now, with a sacred text that tells you this, what do you think is going to be the equality of women in the world? We've got a problem here, and the problem starts with our religious texts and the kind of culture that religious text, that sacred text, has given us. So there's one big problem. And notice the next two verses. Now, I should say, at verse 23, the Latin original says that the woman is called virago because she comes from vir. So you've got enough Latin, I think, to know that vir is male and homo is mankind, and woman is virago. Notice what happens at 24 and 25. "Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." So that conjunction of naked male, naked female is one flesh. So that creates a problem too, because for the rest of history, we are not able to distinguish between the two of them. So much so that property is owned jointly. So much so that the husband is the head of the body, which is the family, and the wife is part of that body. So we see that in the sacred texts that are given to us, we've got a bit of a problem when it comes to gender equality. You go with me there? Now, I'm looking at all of this clearly from a scientific and academic perspective, not a religious one. So I'm not preaching you anti-Christianity or anti-Judaism. But those are, in fact, the things we need to keep in mind. That both the Judeo tradition and the Christian tradition, which is nothing more than a new version of Judaism, they both give us this kind of history. Of the art that's created about the creation of mankind, it's always this consecutive creation story, not the simultaneous creation story that is depicted. Michelangelo, Botticelli, whoever you think of, any artist that has painted the creation of mankind has always painted story number 2. And that's the story that in our imagination fits, that stays behind. And that's the story that has colored us. Now, some of those elements of the story are interesting. This makes the man the creator, the father of humanity, the person that gives birth to the rest of humanity. The very first birth is by a man, not by a woman. So the man is the primordial human being. The woman is the second generation. Do you follow me there? So the consecutive creation story ends up being one of the basic problems, in our having to deal with equity. Had the first story become the standard story, I don't think we would have that many problems today. But unfortunately, it's been the second story. And it's a fact of life. Now, that second story also gives us another problem. And that comes up in Genesis 3. And that's the story about the temptation and the fall. Remember, they're in the Garden of Eden. They're not supposed to eat from the fruit of that one tree. And the serpent convinces Eve to take the apple. And she convinces Adam to eat of the apple. And God gets totally upset and kicks them out of earthly paradise. Now, it's very interesting to read what God says to them after they eat the apple. So if you go to the next page, chapter 3, and that's my next slide. When we get to verse 16, this is, God first of all yells at the serpent at verse 14, and it says, you're going to crawl on the ground for the rest of your eternity. At verse 16, he turns to the woman, and he says, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So, God gives different punishments to the two people. To Eve, he gives pain in childbirth. And then he tells her that she is going to always, although she has pain in childbirth, she is always going to want to have sex and be pregnant. Because that's what that verse really means. In pain you shall give forth children, yet, in spite of that, your desire shall be for your husband. In other words, you're going to desire your husband sexually, so that you continue to inflict that pain of childbirth upon yourself because of this urge for sex. So that's what he's saying to women. And then he says, he shall rule over you. Your husband will rule over you. So here we have it in the sacred text, God saying that woman is to be ruled by her husband. And that conditions all of our thinking for the next 2,000 years. To Adam, instead, he says you're going to work the land and you're going to sweat hard to produce food. But he doesn't give him pay. Last verse, after God has yelled at them, Adam gives a name to the woman, and he calls her Eve. So up to that point, the woman was unnamed. She gets a name only after all of this trouble, which means that Eve, the primordial woman, ends up being associated with the fall, the sin, the punishment. So Eve, as the prototype female, becomes the prototype of all punishment. Are you all with me on that one? Good. Now, just so that I'm not negative only towards the Jews and the Christians, I'm going to be negative against the Greeks too. The Greek mythology is nearly the same. when it comes to gender relations. Now, there are different stories. The Greek and Roman traditions are not as unified as the Judeo-Christian tradition. But I've given you one mythology, one myth that comes from Plato, the great thinker, a wonderful man. Now, in his Timaeus, Plato tells a story. Let's see, I think it's my next slide. A story about how the gods created mankind, and they're all men. The first generation are all male. There's no females, nothing else. In the second generation, there is a division of that gender into men, women, and other beings. When you look at Plato's story, then, let's look at that in your handout. He says, of the men who came into the world, those who were cowards and led unrighteous lives may, with reason, be supposed to have changed into the nature of women in the second generation. So what is Plato saying? Is that men who were cowards come back in their second life, in the second generation, as women, which means that all women are cowards. That's why we don't send women into the army. We don't send them to defend the country, because they're cowards. That's what Plato says. Now, there's a role difference right here that comes from this one really important philosophy. Now, just for interest's sake, in the second generation, I gave you the citation for what happens with other first generation men. Okay, so if you look at your notes, your handout, thus were created women and the female sex in general. But the race of birds, in other words, the birds come from, they were created out of innocent, light-minded men who, although their minds were directed towards heaven, imagined, in their simplicity, that the clearest demonstration of the things above was to be obtained by sight. These were remodeled and transformed into birds, and they grew feathers instead of hair. So that first generation men who were intelligent and were seeking God and were seeking to learn a lot, but thought you could do it just by sight, just by looking at the heavens, they come back not as women, but they come back as birds. Then, next paragraph, the race of wild pedestrian animals, in other words, quadrupeds, cows, horses, pigs, came from those men who had no philosophy in any of their thoughts and never considered at all about the nature of the heavens. So they didn't care about the heavens. But because they had ceased to use the courses of their head, they stopped to use their mind. They no longer use their mind. But followed the guidance of the parts of the soul which are in the breast. So those human men in the first generation who followed their heart rather than their mind come back as animals, quadrupeds. And so you can see the sort of thinking that Plato is proposing